Stephanie and Felix had been married for 6 years, but their childlessness had become a growing concern. Despite visiting various hospitals and trying different herbs, Stephanie remained unable to conceive. One afternoon, while Stephanie was preparing lunch, a knock at the door interrupted her. "Who is there?" she asked. "I'm coming, oh," she replied, opening the door to reveal her mother-in-law, Mrs. Agnes. "Mother," Stephanie exclaimed, surprised. "What's wrong? Why are you surprised to see me, eh?" Mrs. Agnes asked. "Nothing, oh. You are welcome, ma," Stephanie replied, stepping outside. "Make a way," Mrs. Agnes said, entering the house. Felix emerged from the bedroom. "Mother, you are here already." "My son, I have missed you," Mrs. Agnes said, embracing Felix. As they exchanged pleasantries, Stephanie returned to the kitchen to finish cooking. After lunch, Mrs. Agnes retired to the spare room, while Felix and Stephanie retreated to their bedroom. "Why the long face?" Felix asked. "Why didn't you tell me your mother was coming today?" Stephanie replied. "Is that an issue? My mother can visit anytime." "I'm not saying that she can't come, but at least you could have informed me of her arrival," Stephanie clarified. Felix, who signed. "I have no time for this. Abeg, I'm going to sleep." He turned away, ending the conversation. The following morning, Stephanie and Felix woke up to find Mrs. Agnes already cleaning the house. Stephanie approached her, concerned. "Mother, why are you cleaning? You don't have to do this. Please give me the mop." But Mrs. Agnes resisted, holding onto the mop. "Since you don't know what to do or the right thing to do, I have decided to do it myself. A woman like you should be waking up early to tidy up the house, not sleeping until 7 a.m. Stephanie exclaimed, "Mother, I slept late last night. That is why I am waking up this time." But Mrs. Agnes sighed. "You are lazy about everything. Household chores, oh, and even giving my son children, even if it is a female child." Stephanie first tongue. "Mother," Mrs. Agnes pressed on. "Am I not right?" Felix intervened, gently guiding his mother to her room. "That's enough, mother. My wife will take over the cleaning. Please rest. I don't want to see you stressing yourself." Stephanie, hurt by Mrs. Agnes' words, picked up the mop and continued cleaning, her emotions simmering. Stephanie went to work and it was past 8 p.m. She wasn't back yet. Mrs. Agnes paced back and forth, waiting for her. "Ah, mother, why are you walking back and forth? Please sit down," Felix said. "Is this how your wife usually come back late?" "No, she might be busy at work this time around." Just then, a knock at the door interrupted. Mrs. Agnes opened it. It was Stephanie. "Speaking of the devil," she said. "What's wrong, Mama?" "Good evening, Mama. As a married woman, can you not be at home this early? Why are you coming back this late? No, you need to prepare dinner for your husband," Mrs. Agnes scolded. "I prepared different meals yesterday and stored them in the freezer." "So, you women of nowadays cook and store in the freezer. Can't you prepare fresh meals for your husband?" Mrs. Agnes questioned. "Mother, there is food in the freezer. Just warm it up," Stephanie suggested, frowning. "Expecting me and your husband to serve ourselves, eh? What's your job in this house? I see you prioritize work over home." "Mother, what is happening? What is wrong with you?" Stephanie defensively replied. "Mother, I make sure I tidy up the house and prepare meals for the week, and I store them in the freezer because I won't be able to cook every day because of the nature of my job. So, how am I not taking care of the home?" But Mrs. Agnes responded with sarcasm. "So, it has reached to the point where you question me and even shout at me." Felix intervened. "Mother, that's enough. Stephanie, go and change and have a bath." Mrs. Agnes continued. "Imagine what is happening. Modern day women." Felix reassured the mother. "Don't worry, I will warm the food." "No, no, my son, you will do no such thing. She will do it herself." After freshening up, Stephanie warmed and served the food. "Where is your food? Aren't you eating?" Felix asked Stephanie. "I'm not hungry," she replied and went to the bedroom. "My son, eat. Don't talk while eating, Mrs. Agnes advised. After work the next day, when she returned back home, exhausted, and found Felix and the mother already having dinner, she forced a warm smile and greeted them. As she approached the dinner table, she noticed the meal they were eating wasn't the one she prepared. Mother, did you prepare another meal? The food I made is still in the freezer, Stephanie asked. Mrs. Agnes replied, I told you my son deserves freshly cooked food, not frozen meals. You always store. Stephanie's concern grew. But mother, will the food I prepared go to waste? But Mrs. Agnes dismissed her concern. These meals are for you. Felix and I will only eat freshly cooked meal. Stephanie felt frustrated. Oh my God, what is all this now? Mother, what is going on? But she ignored Stephanie's question, focusing on her meal. My son, hope you are enjoying your meal. Felix chimed in. Yes, mother, I really missed your cooking. Stephanie turned to Felix, seeking support. Felix, are you not going to say anything? Felix sided with his mother. You heard her. She's not fond of frozen food. We should adjust and start making fresh meals. Stephanie replied, We've been doing this for years. Why the sudden change? But Felix's response stung. If you are not okay with the changes, let mother do the cooking. Stephanie stormed off to the bedroom, angry and hot. At work, Stephanie's mind wandered, consumed by thoughts of her mother-in-law's constant interference. Her colleague and friend Ruth tried to get her attention. Stephanie, 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 Ruth called, gently tapping her shoulder. Oh, sorry, oh. What were you even thinking? Ruth noticed Stephanie's distraction. What's wrong? You seem troubled. Stephanie hesitated before opening up to her. It is my mother-in-law. She's making life unbearable for me. Ruth's concern was genuine. What's going on? Stephanie shared her frustration as she narrated her encounter with the mother-in-law. Ruth listened attentively, shocked by Mrs. Agnes' behavior. What's wrong with that your mother-in-law, self? Why is she acting this way? Stephanie vented. She's infuriating. I don't know what she wants. Ruth offered support. Your mother-in-law is something else. Don't let her get to you. Honestly, Ruth, I don't know what to do. Ruth offered sage advice. Focus on your job. You are the breadwinner. Since your husband lost his job, if you lose your own, you will face her drama daily. And how will you manage expenses? Stephanie realized Ruth's point. You are right, my dear. I must prioritize my job. I can't afford to lose it because of my house issue. Ruth assured. You are strong, Stephanie. You will get through this. Saturday morning, Stephanie prepared to leave for work. As she headed out of the door, Mrs. Agnes stopped her. Where are you going to? I thought you don't work on weekend. I have unfinished work from last week, and my boss needed it done today. He promised overtime pay, Stephanie explained. Mrs. Agnes disapproved. Does your boss know that you're a married woman? You should be home on weekends. As Stephanie clarified, he knows, but the work must be completed before Monday. But Mrs. Agnes criticized. Oh, because he's paying you overtime, you agree to work on weekend. You working class women only care about job and money. Stephanie defended herself. Mother, if I don't go to work, how are we going to meet up with the household expenses now that Felix is unemployed? I'm trying to help out. But she retorted, so you are rubbing Felix's job loss on his faces. Don't worry. Once he finds a new employment, I am sure you will quit your job and focus on homemaking. Stephanie firmly stated, that won't happen. I won't quit my job. As she walked out of the door, Mrs. Agnes called after her. You are walking out of me? Fine. Stephanie confronted Felix, itching on her face. Honey, isn't it time for your mother to leave? She's been here for several months, but Stephanie's got a wrong response from Felix, which made her stun. Why do you want my mother to leave? She's all I have. Since my dad passed away, she has been alone in the village, and I'm glad she's comfortable here. Stephanie's concern turned to alarm. So you are saying your mother can stay here indefinitely? Whatever she feels like it, and whenever she feels. How can you know she can decide to stay with us forever? Stephanie felt overwhelmed, collapsing on the bed, holding her head in her hands. Felix's tone turned defensive. She's my mother. Do you want me to send her back home? How can I cope with this woman, making my life a living hell? Stephanie thought to herself. One night, Felix woke Stephanie from her sleep. Get up, mother wants to have a meeting with us. Stephanie yawned, confused. What meeting? I don't know. Let's go and find out. Stephanie's mind raced as she wondered why Mrs. Agnes would call for a meeting at that hour. In the sitting room, Mrs. Agnes cleared her throat. I called this meeting to ask why and when I am going to have a grandchild. It's been 6 years and soon your marriage will be 7 years. Felix reassured, Mother, we are trying to conceive. We are waiting on God. Stephanie added, I have had medical tests and everything's fine. Mrs. Agnes' tone turned acidic. Then perhaps the issue is spiritual. How long should my son wait for you to give him a child, even if he's an imbecile? Stephanie's eye wailed in tears. Mother, why say such hurtful words? But Mrs. Agnes remained unsympathetic. Are my words not true? Stephanie fled to their room, overcome with emotions. Felix confronted his mother. Mother, that was too much. Why hurt my wife like that? But she responded, if she can't prove herself by getting pregnant, I will find another wife. Felix rushed to confront Stephanie, leaving his mother's harsh word hanging in the air. Mrs. Agnes' disdainful hiss echoed through the room. Stephanie's tears had long dried, but the sting of Mrs. Agnes' words still lingered. Months passed and their 7th anniversary arrived. Felix, eager to lift Stephanie's spirit, planned an intimate house party. Friends and families gathered and they cut their anniversary cake. Stephanie, attempting to make amends, offered Mrs. Agnes a slice, but her expression turned cold. That is not what I need, she said, her eyes piercing Stephanie. Mrs. Agnes' word hung in the air like a challenge. She hissed, turned her back on Stephanie, and walked away. She stared after her, the rejection stinging. Felix noticed the tension and quickly intervened. Mother, please, he called, but Mrs. Agnes disappeared into her room. The party continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Stephanie's smile faltered, and Felix's attempt to reassure her fell flat. As they celebrated their love, Mrs. Agnes' absence cast a shadow, a reminder of the unresolved tension between Stephanie and her mother-in-law. The tension between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law remained unresolved, and Mrs. Agnes continued to meddle in Stephanie's life. One day, she visited a salon where she found no available seats. A young lady stood up and offered Mrs. Agnes her chair. Thank you, my dear, she said, smiling. Impressed by the lady's kind gesture, Mrs. Agnes thought, what a thoughtful lady. She seemed genuinely kind. As they struck up a conversation, what is your name? I am Morin, the lady replied. Before parting ways, Mrs. Agnes and Morin exchanged contacts, and when she left the salon with a pleasant impression of Morin. Returning home, Mrs. Agnes beamed with joy. Mom, you seem happy. What's the reason? Felix asked. Mrs. Agnes shared her encounter with Morin, praising her kindness and beauty. Felix replied, she sounds nice. Mrs. Agnes soon turned scheming. I think it's time you have a child elsewhere, since your wife can't. Maureen's perfect. I have already told her about you. Felix eyed widened in shock. Mother, I am married. You want me to have a child out of wedlock? But the mother persisted, but Felix refused to consider it. Just then, Stephanie walked in from work, sensing the tense atmosphere. Is everything okay? What's wrong? She asked. Mrs. Agnes signed and retreated to her room. Felix reassured Stephanie, nothing is wrong, just go freshen up. Stephanie nodded, unaware of the disturbing conversation that they had. Mrs. Agnes seized every opportunity to praise Morin to Felix. She persisted, showing Felix Morin's picture on her phone. Isn't she beautiful? I told her about you and she's eager to meet you. Felix's frustration grew. Mother, I have told you countless times, I am married. I won't consider another woman. Mrs. Agnes' tone turned disdainful. You have gotten a better option, but still yet you are still considering that barren woman, she muttered. Felix yelled, Mother, stop this. He walked out of the room, leaving Mrs. Agnes scheming behind. Stephanie was cooking and also tidying up the house. She stepped away to check on the food, only to find that it was replaced with a different dish. Stephanie's voice echoed, Where is the food I am cooking? Mother! Mrs. Agnes walked in. What is it? Mother, where is the food I was cooking now? But she replied, Look at it over there. Stephanie queried, Mother, what is my food doing over there? Why did you take down the food I am cooking? All this while, I thought the food was ready. But she replied, I want to cook and I can't find or wait for your food to be ready, and that is why I decided to put it down. Stephanie's emotion erupted. What's going on, Mother? Are you here to make my marriage a hell? Did you even endure half of what you are doing to me in your own marriage? But Mrs. Agnes' expression turned cold, her eyes flashing with malice. I wasn't barren like you, so why should I experience what you are going through? Stephanie's tears began to drop. Do not call me barren. I had medical tests and nothing is wrong with me. Felix was supposed to go to the hospital to run a test with me, but you stopped him. Mrs. Agnes spilled out, Why should he run the test with you? There's nothing wrong with my son. You are the problem. You are the reason that there is no child in this marriage. Who knows how many children you have aborted and got your womb damaged while you were single, and my son is suffering with you. I don't know what my son saw in you, you barren woman. Stephanie's voice trembled, tears streaming down her face. How dare you say such a hurtful words to me? The air was thick with tension. The rift between them grew wider. Felix burst into the kitchen, alarmed by the commotion. What's going on here? Mrs. Agnes' tears flowed effortlessly. Oh, Felix, your wife insulted me and blamed you for her barrenness. Felix's concern shifted to shock. Stephanie, did you say that? Stephanie clarified, desperation in her voice. No, honey, I never blamed you. Your mother is lying. But Mrs. Agnes feigned offense. Why should I lie to you, my son? Felix's anger grew. So you are saying I am impotent? Stephanie grabs Felix's arms, pleading, Honey, I never say such a word. Your mother isn't telling the truth. But Mrs. Agnes fueled the fire. Ungrateful woman, after all Felix had done for you, you dare question his fertility? Felix shrugged off Stephanie's grip. Get your hands off me. He stormed out of the house, leaving Stephanie in tears. Mrs. Agnes' satisfied smile was hidden behind her fake tears. Stephanie anxiously waited for Felix's return, but he remained cold and distant. Despite her effort to explain and clear the air, Felix ignored her, his silence piercing. Mrs. Agnes seized the opportunity to fuel the rift, badmouthing Stephanie and praising Morin's virtues. Stephanie was watching TV. She got interrupted by a knock on the door. As she went to answer it, finding Morin at the door. Morin greeted Stephanie warmly and asked for Mrs. Agnes. Come in, I will get her for you. Mrs. Agnes burst out of her room beaming. My dear, welcome home. She enveloped Morin in a tight hug. Mrs. Agnes called out to Felix, her voice dripping with excitement. Come out, oh, Felix, we have a guest. He emerged from his room, his eyes locking onto Morin. He embraced her. He complimented her looks with admiration. You look stunning in person. I didn't know you were this beautiful. Morin blushed at Felix's compliment. Stephanie's patience snapped. What's going on here? Felix and Mrs. Agnes ignored her. Stephanie repeated, her voice firmer. I said, what is going on here? Who is she? Mrs. Agnes retorted. She's Felix's visitor. Do you have a problem with that? But Stephanie's eye narrowed. Yes, I do. Felix, when did you start having female visitors? Felix introduced Morin nonchalantly. Stephanie, meet Morin. The air was thick with tension as Stephanie's suspicions grew. Stephanie grabbed Felix's hand, pulling him aside. Felix, what is going on here? Who is she? She asked, her voice laced with concern. Felix's response was icy. Who she is none of your business. Stephanie's eyes widened. It is my business. I am your wife. Felix turned. turned cruel. She's the woman who will give me a child since you cannot. Stephanie's face contorted in shock. What? Felix. Felix was cut deep. You question my fertility? I will prove that I am not impotent by getting Morin pregnant. Stephanie's voice rose. This is your mother's doing. She's wicked, bringing another woman into our home. Felix's anger boiled over, and he slapped Stephanie. How dare you call my mother wicked? She's doing what's best for me. If you can't accept it, leave it. Felix stormed off, leaving Stephanie, cracking, stinging cheek as tears streamed down her face. He rejoined Morin and Mrs. Agnes, continued their discussion as they all burst out laughing as if nothing occurred. Mrs. Agnes' satisfied smile hinted at her manipulation. Stephanie's heart shattered, realizing her marriage was crumbling. Stephanie's heart sank as Felix and Mrs. Agnes continued to ignore her. She cooked dinner, hoping to bridge the gap, but Felix dismissed her effort. I am not eating, he said, his tone cold. Mrs. Agnes echoed his refusal. Neither am I. Stephanie tried persuading them, but they remained resolute. Just as Stephanie was about to clear the table, Mrs. Agnes dropped a bombshell. Morin is on her way here. She will prepare dinner for us. Felix responded, Okay, mother. Stephanie entered the kitchen, ready to cook before heading to work, only to find Morin already at the stove. Without a word, Stephanie moved Morin's pot aside and placed her own on the burner. Morin's eye narrowed. I'm about to cook. Didn't you see that before taking my pot away? Stephanie's voice rose. Are you questioning me in my own kitchen? Is it because I kept quiet and let you enter my home and kitchen uninvited? Mrs. Agnes swept into the kitchen, her presence commanding attention. What's going on here? Morin explained, her tone indignant. Stephanie took my pot and wouldn't let me cook. Mrs. Agnes expressed twisted in discourse. This is all you can do. Boast about your kitchen. What else do you have to brag about in this house? Others pride themselves on their children. You are clinging to this kitchen. Mrs. Agnes turned to Morin. Let's leave her. She's clearly territorial. Mrs. Agnes shot Stephanie a venomous glance, hissing softly before storming out with Morin. Stephanie stood frozen, tears welled in her eyes. As Mrs. Agnes and Morin were chatting in the sitting room, Felix burst in beaming with joy. Stephanie, curious about the commotion, left the kitchen to investigate. My son, you are radiating happiness. Share the good news with us. I got a job, Felix announced excitedly. Really, a job? The woman danced with joyful dance, singing praises. Morin hugged Felix, offering warm congratulations. Mrs. Agnes taunted. It seems God has finally put someone in shame. Now let's see how your wife will carry herself as the breadwinner of the household. Just because she has a job and you don't, she thinks she can do whatever pleases her. Stephanie approached, her voice calm. Honey, congratulations, I'm happy for you. Felix acknowledged her with a nod, then quickly turned back to his mother. Mrs. Agnes shot Stephanie a disapproving glance, her expression tinged with disdain. She beamed with pride, turning to Felix. My son, we must celebrate this special occasion. What would you like to eat? I will whip it up right away. Felix's face lit up as he requested his favorite dish. Mrs. Agnes and Morin busied themselves in the kitchen, preparing the feast. However, amidst the joy and celebration, Stephanie stood apart, feeling overlooked and ignored. She stared blankly at her computer screen, her mind consumed by marital woes. Ruth approached, concern etching on her face. Stephanie, what's going on? Ruth asked, handed her a document. Stephanie's confusion was evident. What do you mean? Ruth pointed out the mistake in the document. You have been careless with your work before. What's distracting you? Stephanie apologized and promised to correct the errors. Ruth's expression softened as she sat beside Stephanie, taking her hand. Friend, what's bothering you? You seemed unhappy lately. You can talk to me. Stephanie's tears flowed as she shared her marital struggles. Ruth listened intently. You are enduring this? Ruth asked. Your mother-in-law is wicked, bringing another woman into your home. Stephanie nodded, wiping away her tears. I feel like a stranger in my husband's house. I cook and eat alone. He doesn't talk to me. It's as if I married to myself. Ruth's question hung in the air. Do you still want to be in the marriage? Stephanie looked up and said, I love my husband. I hope he realized his mistake and his mother's scheme. Ruth's expression turned skeptical. I hope you are making the right decision. After work, Ruth drove Stephanie home, concern each on her face. Stephanie, take time to reflect on your marriage. Your husband's actions are unacceptable. He is bringing another woman into your home. Think carefully about what is best for you. Stephanie nodded and tears welled up in her face. Thank you, Ruth. They shared a heartfelt hug before Ruth drove away. As Stephanie entered her home, she met Mrs. Agnes and Felix, celebrating Morin's pregnancy. Finally, Felix will be a father, she exclaimed. Stephanie walked past them, trying to ignore the sting of Mrs. Agnes' word. I made the right decision introducing you to my son, Mrs. Agnes said, her voice dripping with malice. You brought joy to this family, unlike the barren woman my son married 7 years ago. Not even an imbecile has she given him as a child. Morin's laughter filled the room. Mother, you don't have to worry anymore. You will soon be a grandmother. Stephanie's heart sank as she overheard the conversation. She felt a chill down her spine. What will become of me now that Morin is pregnant? My husband will ignore me even more, and my mother-in-law will make my life unbearable. Overwhelmed, Stephanie quickly called Ruth. Ruth, please come back. I need to leave this place, Stephanie begged, tears streaming down her face. Ruth's response was immediate. I am turning back. Hang in there. Stephanie packed all her belongings, tears streaming down her face as she carried her luggage outside. Mrs. Agnes mocked her. Finally, the barren woman has realized her place. Leave! There is no room for you here. Felix appeared, his expression cold. My lawyer will send divorce papers. Sign them. Stephanie's heart shattered. Ruth arrived, offering a supportive embrace. Let's get out of here, Ruth said, helping Stephanie with her luggage. At Stephanie's apartment, Ruth tried to console her. Stephanie's grief was overwhelming, but she couldn't face work. Ruth excused her absence, securing a leave. Days passed, with Felix's lawyer sending divorce papers. Stephanie hesitated, but Felix's persistent calls and Mrs. Agnes' venomous insults wore her down. You are hindering Felix and Morin's happiness, Mrs. Agnes spat. Sign that paper, you useless woman. Crushed, Stephanie signed the papers and sent them back. Ruth applauded her bravery. It's time to move on, dear. You deserve better. Felix swiftly married Morin, but Stephanie began rebuilding her life. 3 years after her divorce, Stephanie reunited with an old friend, Leonard. As they spent more time together, Leonard revealed his long-held feelings and proposal. Touched by Leonard's sincerity, Stephanie realized he truly loved her. A few months later, they married. Miraculously, Stephanie discovered she was pregnant shortly after. Overjoyed and surprised, she reflected on her previous marriage. How could I struggle with infertility for 7 years with Felix, only to conceive effortlessly with Leonard, she wondered. Leonard's love and acceptance had healed her emotional scars. Meanwhile, Morin's world crumbled when her presumed pregnancy proved false. Symptoms had misled them, and the truth shattered her. Mrs. Agnes, once enamored with Morin, turned against her. 3 years of marriage and no child. My son is unfortunate, always finding barren women. Morin's guilt consumed her. Am I being punished for ruining Stephanie's home? Desperate, Morin sought fertility herbs, but none yielded results. Her anxiety grew as Mrs. Agnes' criticism intensified. Felix distanced himself. You are just like Stephanie, unable to give me a child. Morin's isolation deepened, trapped in a loveless marriage. 2 years passed and Stephanie's life was filled with joy, raising her son. But then, familiar symptoms resurfaced: morning sickness, fatigue, and craving. She scheduled a hospital visit, her heart racing with anticipation. At the hospital, the doctor greeted her warmly. Stephanie, what brings you here today? I think I might be pregnant again, Stephanie replied. The doctor smiled. Let's run some tests. The wait seems eternal, but after everything, the doctor returned with a beaming smile. Congratulations, Stephanie. You are pregnant again. Stephanie beamed with joy as the doctor confirmed her pregnancy. She hastily gathered her belongings and rushed out of the hospital, eager to share the news with her husband. Meanwhile, Morin visited the hospital, seeking answers for her infertility. As she walked down the corridor, she spotted Stephanie strolling by with a toddler. Morin's eye widened. Is that Stephanie? And is that her child? She wondered. Curiosity got the better of her. Morin approached the doctor. Excuse me, doctor. I just saw my friend Stephanie leaving your office. Did she come for a pregnancy test? The doctor nodded. Yes, she did, and she's pregnant. Morin forced a smile. Wow, I'm happy for her. Morin turned back home, furious. She banged on the door. Mrs. Agnes opened it, scolding. What's wrong with you? Knocking like that? She asked. Morin brushed past her. Where is your precious son? She demanded. Felix emerged from his room. What's going on here? Morin confronted him. You and your mother made me feel like a barren man, but the truth is that you are the one who is infertile. Mrs. Agnes shouted. How dare you accuse my son, you barren woman? Morin fired. What do you know, you uneducated woman? Felix's anger flared, and he raised his hand. Don't dare hit me, you ignorant man, Morin warned. Then she dropped a bombshell. I saw Stephanie at the hospital today. She's married, has a son, and is pregnant again. If Stephanie once called barren, now has children, who really is at fault, Stephanie or Felix? Morin's word hung in the air. But Mrs. Agnes denied. My son cannot be impotent. Morin countered. You never considered Felix might be the issue. You blamed Stephanie and me for not conceiving, but Felix is the one who is infertile. Felix stood still, questioning himself. Is it possible I'm impotent? Morin packed her bags, her voice laced with anger. I regret marrying you. I wasted time and dignity on fertility herb, thinking I was the problem. Mrs. Agnes pleaded. Please don't leave. Morin looked at her. Stay for what? To gaze at your son's face every day? I want a child and Felix can't give me. Felix crumbled. Oh no, this can't be. Am I truly impotent? After a heated discussion, Felix and Mrs. Agnes resolved to find Stephanie and beg for her forgiveness. Stephanie's eyes widened in shock as she stood face to face with her past. Felix, Mrs. Agnes, what brings you here? How did you find my address? She asked, surprise etched on her face. Mrs. Agnes pleaded, please let us in. We will explain everything. Stephanie hesitated, then invited them. As they sat, her son ran to her crying. She tutored him, and Mrs. Agnes' eyes widened. So it is true. You are a mother now, Mrs. Agnes said, her voice tinged with regret. Stephanie nodded, her expression firm. Yes, I am. Now explain why you are here and how you found me. Mrs. Agnes revealed she obtained Stephanie's address from a colleague. Felix took a deep breath. I have realized my mistake, Stephanie. I was blind to my own flaws. Mrs. Agnes added, we were wrong to blame you for Felix's issue. We are sorry. Stephanie responded, I hold no grudges. I have moved on, found happiness, and left the past behind. But Mrs. Agnes' next words stunned Stephanie. Please, come back to us. We will treat you well. Accept your child as ours. Stephanie's eyes widened. I am married. What are you suggesting? Mrs. Agnes' desperation grew. Felix was your husband. Help my son by returning to him. Stephanie replied, should I leave my loving husband, who stood by me even when he thought I was infertile, for the man who rejected and humiliated me because of it? Stephanie's patience lapsed. Leave my house now. Mrs. Agnes protested. It hasn't come to that, my daughter. Stephanie's voice rose. I said, leave my house now. This is my husband's house and not Felix. Felix and Mrs. Agnes retreated, their faces etched with shame. Felix trudged home, shattered. He blamed his mother for his downfall. If only I had listened to my instincts and ran the test with Stephanie, I would have known I was impotent and sought treatment. But no, I listened to her. You convinced me that Stephanie and Morin were the problem. Mrs. Agnes defended herself. I did it all for you, my son. Felix's anger boiled over. You ruined my marriage, my life. Leave my house, mother. Go back to the village. Mrs. Agnes' eyes widened. You are chasing me from your house? Felix's voice rose. Leave now. Mrs. Agnes hastily packed her belongings, tears streaming down her face. As she departed, Felix collapsed, consumed by regret. Why didn't I listen to my heart? Why did I let my mother control me? He spent his days haunted by what-ifs, longing to turn back the hands of time and bringing his beautiful wife Stephanie back home. But it was too late, because Stephanie had already found love in a man who clearly adores and loves her.